Consider the 16th century world map. Compared to the sprawling Ottoman and Spanish empires, England was an island kingdom of roughly 3 million people. Yet by 1914, it controlled 25% of Earth's land, ruling over 458 million people, an impossible statistical growth. Unlike historical conquerors like Genghis Khan or Alexander the Great, the British did not rely on massive, expensive land armies to achieve this scale. At the start of this expansion, Britain lacked the wealth, the population, and the internal resources required to sustain a traditional war of continental conquest. This resource gap forced a strategic pivot. Britain achieved global dominance by turning imperialism into a high-efficiency multinational business, utilizing the mechanics of trade to accomplish what their small population could not do on the battlefield. The strategy relied on the joint stock company. This allowed private investors to pool their capital, sharing the immense financial risks of outfitting overseas expeditions in exchange for a piece of the profit. The British government then explicitly outsourced the work of exploration and territorial conquest to these private corporations, allowing organizations like the East India Company to manage the state's expansion on a for-profit basis. This drive for corporate efficiency led to the commodification of human beings through the transatlantic slave trade. In this image of an enslaved boy, the physical reality of his tattered clothing and leg irons grounds the corporate strategy in its human cost. A ruthless corporate ledger sat at the foundation of this expansion. For these organizations, shareholder dividends consistently outranked human lives. To protect these corporate assets and trade routes, Britain developed the ultimate private security force, the Royal Navy. Decisive naval victories systematically removed European rivals, granting Britain an unchallenged monopoly over the world's most lucrative ocean trade routes. As the Industrial Revolution began, the empire's objectives shifted. Looking at these rows of spinning machinery, you can see how the scale of British industrialization required a constant, massive influx of raw materials. This created a closed-loop economic system. Colonies were forced to extract cheap raw materials, like cotton and rubber, and export them exclusively to the central British node. The Navy then ensured those same colonies bought the finished manufactured goods back at a premium. This system drained local wealth and returned it to the central British ledger. This parasitic economic engine turned Britain into the wealthiest nation on Earth by intentionally stunting the economic independence of its captive global markets. A corporate empire survives only as long as its revenues exceeds its operating costs, a balance that the 20th century permanently broke. World War II inflicted a catastrophic financial toll. Looking at the destruction of the London city centre, you see the evidence of a mainland that was overstretched, exhausted, and deeply in debt. Simultaneously, the operating costs of the empire skyrocketed. Massive, highly organized nationalist resistance movements, like these in India, demanded independence, making colonial control increasingly difficult to maintain. Violent counterinsurgencies, such as the campaign against the Mau Mau uprising, became unsustainable. Maintaining the intense military resources required to guard captive populations was no longer a viable expense for a bankrupt nation. The imperial business model eventually went bankrupt. The sheer financial and political cost of suppressing global independence movements finally outweighed the profits of colonial exploitation. Britain was forced into a massive restructuring. They surrendered formal political control to newly independent nations, transitioning the remnants of the empire into the voluntary Commonwealth. But the empire left behind a systemic architecture, the global dominance of the English language, international trade laws, and arbitrarily drawn geopolitical borders that continue to define modern conflicts. The foundational systems of modern global capitalism were prototyped during this era, and the scars of its resource exploitation are still evident in the economies of former colonies. While the formal British Empire eventually dissolved, the corporate systems, economic models, and global inequalities it engineered continue to drive the modern world today.